The myth of aid to Africa. Africa pays more in debt servicing than it receives in aid, new loans, and other financial assistance added together. For every United States dollar Africa receives in aid, it pays back $2.30 on average in debt servicing. This represents a staggering 130% return on investment. To date, an estimated $30 billion in overseas aid is given to Africa annually, but $192 billion leaves the continent each year through debt repayments to private and other governments lenders, profits accrued by multinational companies, tax evasions, and illicit financial flows facilitated by tax havens by the West, and illegal logging. If this is dead aid for the Africans, it is surely lucrative for the donors. A significant portion of aid money, potentially 20 to 40%, may not reach the intended beneficiaries. It is allocated to administrative costs, including salaries, infrastructure, and project management by the donor community. Since the 1970s, debt servicing became the primary means by which wealth was transferred from indebted third world countries to the West. Speaking at the July 1994 summit of the seven most industrialized nations G7 in Naples, French President François Mitterrand said, "Despite the considerable sums spent on bilateral and multilateral aid, the flow of capital from Africa toward the industrial countries is greater than the flow of capital from the industrial countries to the developing countries." Aid to Africa comes in the form of charitable and emergency or humanitarian aid, grants, funds given to governments and are not meant to be paid back, and concessional loans, which are long-term debt instruments. Critics of this aid contend that it has been responsible for perpetuating bad governments, enlarging their bureaucracies, creating and enriching a class of political elites in recipient countries. They have further argued that foreign aid in Africa has had a negative impact on development by feeding and enhancing a culture of corruption. It is cited as being responsible for the destruction of agricultural and industrial production, depressing exports, causing increased unemployment, weakening local markets, undermining entrepreneurship, and has resulted in more dependence. Some critics simply consider aid as wasted or dead. The proponents, however, argue that aid has supported poverty reduction and that without it, Africa's condition would have been worse. They also contend that aid has stimulated growth and reconstruction in some countries like Botswana and Ghana and has prevented worse performance in others. Over most of the past 50 years, the United States took the lead in advancing foreign aid for developing countries. Foreign aid priorities were driven by the Cold War against the Communist Soviet Union, and Africa became the ideological battleground. The United States saw fighting hunger and poverty as a way to slow communism and lure third world governments towards their worldview. For example, the biggest recipients of US aid in Africa in the 1980s were dictatorships in Somalia, Sudan, and Liberia. This aid was given in spite of the violence that was still afflicting these countries up to today. Since the end of the Cold War, however, the funding has dropped.